And joining us now on the debate, William Fowler Jr., Distinguished Professor of History at Northeastern University and author of Empires at War. In our nation's capital, Charlotte Gray, Chair of the Board at Canada's History Society and author of Gold Diggers. And with us here in studio, John Ralston Saul, General Editor of the Penguin Extraordinary Canadians Project and author of Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin, and President of PEN International. Craig Herron, Professor of History at York University and author of Booze, A Distilled History, and David Wilson, Professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto and author of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, Volumes 1 and 2. Welcome to you all. Good to have you here. I want to kick off our conversation by reading a quotation. Take a listen to this. This comes from Alan Greer, who's a Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. He wrote this back in 2005. Here's what he said. As someone who has spent 30 years researching, writing, and teaching the history of Canada, I hear two main messages from my fellow Canadians about my favorite subject. One, it's boring. Two, we need more of it. The same people who tell you that Canadian history is a snooze will nod in agreement with a newspaper report raising the alarm over the latest Dominion Institute poll showing that the average 14-year-old doesn't know the difference between John A. Macdonald and Ronald MacDonald. We need more Canadian history in the schools. They will insist more historical content in the media. If this is to be a self-respecting country, every citizen should have the names of prime ministers and the dates of battles at their fingertips. And by the way, which is my attempt at snoring, so forgive me for that. But David Wilson, I want to start with you. What do you think about the accusation that Canadian history is boring?
Well, it depends on who's writing the history and what they're writing about. E.H. Carr, many years ago, said, facts don't speak for themselves, historians make the facts speak. So how the historian makes the facts speak, how the historian writes, how the historian draws on research, presents the material, and the subject matter. There are some subjects that lend themselves to dramatic narrative and others that don't. For example, in my own work, writing about the Fenians, D'Arcy McGee and the Fenians, there's a very strong dramatic line in that. Writing about, say, representation by population, that's more of a challenge. It's equally important, but more of a challenge. So I can't give you a straight answer. It depends. Okay,
Charlotte Gray. David Wilson says that, you know, it's as much about the storyteller and the method as what's being written about. Do you agree with that, or is Canadian history just plain old drab?
Canadian history isn't at all drab. I absolutely agree that it's all in the writing. I mean, history used to be a literary art. And about 40 years ago, it sort of became subsumed into social sciences and a different approach was taken, a more analytic approach in universities. And this did not translate well into a kind of history that had any kind of popular appeal. When people talk about history, they're looking, or when I say people, I mean non-academics like me, we're looking for ways into the past which will both be stimulating and which will have some meaning to us. And so, in fact, university history in the last 40 years has let go of that popular audience. And we're only now coming back to really good stories.
Okay, Craig Herron, you're at the university, at York University. What do you think of what Charlotte said?
Well, I think it's a very popular critique of us, and I think it's quite unfair. To step back to your original question and then come back to Charlotte's response, it seems to me that the usual point of comparison is with some much more dramatic history that's told south of the border, that the Americans really had a much more interesting history than we did. Well, in actual fact, we have a brilliant and a dramatic history of war. In fact, our involvement in the First World War was way more intense and gripping than the Americans. We have a history of a kind of civil war that involved our native people, the Riel Rebellion and all of that. We have histories of the struggles over the vote that women waged. We have histories of unemployment where people were in the streets and marching on Ottawa. We have histories of major strikes that happened in Winnipeg and elsewhere, all of which, including the history of the consumption of alcohol, which also is a big item in the United States, have been written up by historians over the last 40 years and have been consumed. It's not as if we've ignored these issues. And I think that in actual fact, most of those books and those studies have found an audience. And my argument would be that it's partly a question of how you do it, but it's also what kinds of history appeal to certain people. we assume there has to be a baseline history that everyone agrees with, what's taught in the history textbooks in grade 8, 9, 10. But in actual fact, it seems to me that the great majority of people latch onto history that has meaning to them. And it's the kind of niche markets of history, if you like, so that we have people interested in women's history, we have people interested in various ethnic histories, Aboriginal history, and so on. In each of those fields, there are historians who work in, professional academic historians who work to write the kind of history that those people want, and they do have an audience beyond the academy for that.
Okay, we're going to talk more about the specifics of what make up Canadian history, but I want to bring Bill Fowler in here. Bill, you're on the outside across the border looking in. Right. Let me flip the question on the head. What makes Canadian history so interesting?
Well, first let me say that with all due respects to Mr. Greer, I find his comment unusual, and I hope my Canadian colleagues, as I do sense, take some umbrage at what he has to say about Canadian history being boring. No national history is boring. The creation, the growth of a nation is always intrinsically interesting. It depends upon how it is taught. And here I would emphasize teaching. I realize we're all scholars and writers, but in point of fact, teaching in the classroom is where young people and elderly people, museums, are most likely to come in contact with the history of their nation. So it is through teaching. And so therefore it's teaching with power, with clarity, with excitement, and any topic can be made interesting. So to describe a national history, any national history, as boring seems to me entirely incorrect and missing the point. Shame on people who would, teachers in particular. I would hope that there are no teachers in Canadian classrooms describing to their students that somehow the history of their nation is boring.
John Ralston-Saul, do you have issue with what Alan Greer wrote, or is Canadian history drab?
Well, Alan Greer is a great historian, and he's done a lot of fantastic work, and anybody who's done anything on New France, French Canada admires Alan Greer enormously, and I think he was being ironic. I think the second thing is that Canadians have read an enormous amount of Canadian history going back well into the middle of the 19th century on. Probably in the last 30, 40 years has been a bit of a problem, and this is not aimed at the professor in the United States at all, where there's been a growing obsession in the media, and just the very fact we're opening the show with really a dumb question, if I may say, which is not addressed to you, but to the producer. A really, really dumb question, in order that we waste our time on it, when it actually is irrelevant. And this is all part of, what is Canada? Canada's not the United States. It's part of that completely idiotic approach towards wasting our time and not thinking about what we actually do. History is about doing the research, finding the line, finding what's exciting, as everybody's been saying, and knowing how to write. And if you can't write, then it's raw research, and that's very useful to the people who can write, And there are lots of people who write really well in this country. I just did a series of 18 books for called Extraordinary Canadians, and went out to 18 of the greatest writers in the country. Some of them are novelists, some of them are historians, and I could have gone to another 18 and another 18. And one of the really exciting things is you realize that a lot of the key figures in this country, and this comes back to another element, which is what I would call the late Victorian, early colonial, and then late colonial misrepresentation of the country, that not only must we be boring, but we must be old and sort of hardly able to move, and overweight and everything. And you start looking at these people. McGee was what, dead at 43?
42.
42. LaFontaine, sort of dead in his early. All these people were famous, did their stuff when they were 18 years old, 21 years old, 25 years old. Bethune, dead in his early 40s. I mean, these are really exciting young people taking enormous risks and living an enormous story. But how old was Riel when he was hung? Early 40s, I think, wasn't it? Some early 40s. I mean, and when he founded Manitoba, he was what, in his early 30s? I mean, these are amazing stories. And just if I may take a shot, even though they're friends of mine, the Dominion Institute does polls precisely in order to prove that we're stupid. They're part of that problem. And the fact is that all those numbers about not knowing the difference between the McDonald's, you could do the same thing in England or France or the United States and you get the same thing. It's another problem.
Okay, first of all, I need to defend my producer. He's
a good guy.
He's pretty smart.
Yeah.
But let's try out this question that he's written. Maybe this is a dumb one in your opinion, too. Polling, which you just mentioned, does show, I'm not going to throw out numbers there, but it does show that Canadians' knowledge of history is disappointingly weak. And I'm wondering, I want to begin with you, David. Should that concern us? Should we be disappointed that Canadians don't know their own history?
Well, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about history as names and dates, people who can't remember when the War of 1812 began? Are we talking about history as a story? Or are we talking about history as an inquiry, which I think it is, rather than a story? And we have many different approaches. I think that's come out already. Actually, to come back to Alan Greer for a moment, to be fair to Alan Greer, he was describing his students' response to Canadian history, not describing his own. But we all have these different approaches, and there are pitfalls within each approach. I mean, within the academy, there are definitely pitfalls. There's the danger of excessively narrow focus, not asking what the broader implications of your research may be. There's also the danger of jargon. This relates to a point that Charlotte is making, I think. I have a really hard time with historical jargon. Dense sites of heated contestation, the eyes glaze over. And too often banal ideas are dressed up in the gaudy clothes of theory. So that's another issue. But there are also, I think, problems when it comes to non-historians writing history, that the pitfall there can be the story takes over and sensationalism rules the day. Everything is sacrificed, or much is sacrificed, for the sake of the story. So I think we need to navigate between these pitfalls. And I think actually most writers of Canadian history do that successfully. The problem is getting the audience.
Craig, go ahead.
I think
Can I come back to the question of the poll? Because there's another poll that a group of historians have been doing over the last 6 or 8 years, which is to go out to, I think, 3,500 Canadians and do in-depth interviews with them about what their historical knowledge is. And this is patterned on what was done in Western Europe, in the United States, and in Australia.
Is this the thing done by Margaret Conrad?
Yes. Canadians View Their Past, I think it's called, or something like that. View Canadian History. And what they've come away with is that virtually all of them are engaged with history and have a strong sense of history, and that they move outward from their own experience and their family experience and their community experience, and can then connect up to a larger body of experience, mostly through what they identify with closely. And that is, in many ways, apart from the national experience. And so that when the Dominion Institute comes in, they're not going to ask them about what they know a great deal about in their immediate range, which in fact, in the way that they find that knowledge, which is often not through the classroom, it's through a variety of contacts with museums and family sources and local sources of various kinds, they'll connect with the national history in their own ways.
Okay, so we seem to be making the point that Canadians know our history better than numbers and polls seem to show. But Charlotte, let me ask you this, because I would argue that, you know, all the names that John rattled off, Bethune, Riel, that most Canadians can't identify the people we have on our money. So I want to ask you this. When we're telling our Canadian history stories, are we telling the right stories?
Well, I think actually the fundamental problem is that we're actually not telling Canadian stories. Only 4 provinces out of the 10 provinces of Canada actually mandate Canadian history in their curriculum, which means students in 6 provinces don't learn any Canadian history. So it's very unfair to sort of rush up to them with a microphone and say what date was Confederation, because unless you know, they've actually seen a documentary recently on television, they've never learned that fact. So when you say, are we telling the right stories? The first answer is we're not telling enough stories generally. The second point really is there aren't any right stories. People will relate to something that speaks to them. There are so many different entry points into history, and as many of the others have already said, you know, there's museums, there's family history, there's what you see on television, there's now websites, there's apps. And one of the strengths of Canada has always been that this is a very big tent. And there are many, many stories within that tent of the different groups of immigrants who've arrived here, the First Nations story. The fact we don't have an overarching narrative in the way that most, for instance, European countries have adopted, or certainly in the United States, is something which we grapple with, but actually makes our history fantastically interesting because we deal constantly with competing interests.
John, pick up on that. Charlotte saying that, we don't have one history, we have many histories. Is that part of the challenge?
That's not exactly what she was saying. It's not that we have many histories, which makes it sound like all these pods that are unrelated. Is that there are many ways of telling the story from different points of view. I mean, I just came from North Bay, where I spent, 2 days mainly with First Nations people, telling the story of the area in one way, and then there are other people there telling the same story in another way, but they're actually in the same room, having a great time telling the story. So it's not like these isolated pods and that there's no civilization, whatever that means. It's that it's very unusual to be in a country which is what I call non-monolithic, which is not in the European or to some extent the US model, which is that idea that a country is a place with one theme, that it all has to feed into the stream, even though it never really does. And this is a country which has never really tried to do that. And you really have to beware of the idea that we've all got to buy into the importance of certain people and certain dates. Well, yes and no. And I'd say, what Charlotte said about they are not teaching enough history in school is absolutely true. Ontario is extremely problematic. Ontario picked up a high school method of doing curricula, which is based on the failed system of the British in the 1950s. So, you have to have 1.5 courses of phys ed to get through high school, or 1.5 courses of French to get through high school, which, so imagine what that does to history. There's no continuity, there's no real learning in there. So we have to teach it a great deal more, but we also have to enjoy it. Enjoy it for its strangeness, for the fact that it isn't in the British or the US or the French model. It's not, desperately attempting to produce this monolithic theme.
How do you enjoy it, though? What do you mean by that?
How do you enjoy it? Because it's fun, because it's tragic, because it's interesting, because it's curious, because Nellie McClung, who Charlotte wrote about, is this beautiful young woman who comes off a farm and, unlike all the other feminists of the time, isn't just looking for the vote. She's actually worried about young women from Central Europe being exploited in horrible factories, and does, in that tragedy, understands that comedy is the way to win. And she makes the women's movement fairly mainstream by being incredibly funny. And she has theaters filled with men and women in which the men are laughing their heads off, and then they suddenly discover they're laughing at themselves. And one of the results of that is that women in Manitoba get the vote ahead of everyone else in Canada and pretty well everyone else in the world. So, I mean, it's incredibly exciting. People look at a guy like Norman Bethune, and a lot of Canadians know who that is, and they think that's a kind of adventure. A man who becomes the hero of 1.5 billion Chinese and dies in the process. The only man written about by Mao Zedong, or who was the greatest orator on the Canadian prairies through about 40 years of the 19th century? Big Bear, who spoke neither English nor French. And you say, gosh, this is really interesting. And the way the sort of Protestant orange judges and juries did everything to prevent his message from being translated into English. I mean, there's nothing boring about this. There's something incredibly exciting about it and fun. And there are a lot of history professors in the high schools who are working very hard to get the kids into it so they understand and enjoy it.
Bill, I'm wondering, do you hear these same laments in the United States about people there not knowing their history as well as they might or should?
Oh, absolutely. But first, let me just make a comment that American history, at least this side of the border, is hardly monolithic. So it is an incredibly diverse subject. First, I'd observe that history enrollments in universities here in the United States, the enrollments are in decline, have been for some years, continue to be in decline. For a number of reasons, not the least of it being that the curriculum in American universities is so diverse now, students are drawn in a variety of different directions. It's now quite possible for a university graduate to complete 4 or 5 years without ever having taken a course in American history, which means, of course, that we rely then upon the secondary schools. And I think it's there where history needs to be better taught, and the professors, teachers teaching at the secondary level need to be better prepared, and they're not. Let me also observe, perhaps in contradiction to some of my colleagues, that I happen to believe that history is a story. It is a narrative. It needs to be told. It has plot. It needs to have characters and description. It's no surprise to me that when you look at the New York Times bestseller list in nonfiction, guess what always tops the list? It is biography. Biography. Walter Isaacson on Steve Jobs, or it's David McCullough on John Adams, or others on Abraham Lincoln, Bill O'Reilly, because it's a story. And people can read those stories and not only learn history, but there's something else critical here. They have to be able to identify with it. Taught in a sterile kind of environment where students cannot identify with the story that's going on, I think really misses the point. And one other point I would make too, and we ought not as professional historians allow this to get out to the public, but guess what? Anyone can be an historian. I think that we have come so far to professionalize our discipline, to put walls up as if those outside, those non-academics, those without PhDs, proper training, methodologies, seminars, etc., are somehow not real historians, which is absolutely false. The market is deciding for us. We can argue and debate about what history is about, but you only need to look at the market. And I think for too long we have ignored the market. What is it that people want to read, and how can we provide that kind of thing with good style, with an attention to good writing? I was never taught good writing in graduate school. I was taught to research and to write, but the sense of writing well, adequately, all right. But it was really the matter of getting the facts correct and doing the research. So if there is a failure, it is ours. I don't think we can blame the victims. It is our failure not to be able to, not to be trying better, searching, finding ways to communicate to a broader audience, which, judging from reading habits, judging from bestseller lists, wish to read history.
Okay, Bill, you say that, you don't have the domain of history if you're a historian, but listen to this quotation. This comes from Margaret Macmillan. You may not be familiar with it, but she's a very well-respected Canadian historian. Here's what she wrote. Already much of the history that the public reads and enjoys is written by amateur historians. Some of it is very good, but much of it is not. Bad history tells only part of complex stories. It makes sweeping generalizations, which there is not adequate evidence, and ignores awkward facts which do not fit. It demands too much from its protagonists, as when it expects them to have had insights or made decisions that they could not possibly have done. The lessons such history teaches are too simple or simply wrong. Take a crack at that, will you, Bill?
That's precisely the sweeping condemnation that I'm talking about. There, in one statement, she is dismissing, virtually dismissing, all of the history that people are reading. I mean, how can we do that? Is she dismissing my side of the border, David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Walter Isaacson? I could go down the list of, quote, amateur historians. What does it mean to be an amateur historian? Writing history is not a profession. I don't quite understand the term amateur historian. They're certainly being paid for it. In fact, they're being paid a lot more than I am to write history. So what does it mean to be an amateur historian? Did not complete the seminar, does not have a PhD? That seems to me a shallow distinction.
And can I just add to that? I mean, again, I'm defending, as a non-academic, I'm now defending a second academic. Margaret says exactly the opposite. I don't know what the context for that was. But she herself said, when she took part in the Extraordinary Canadian series, that one of the reasons there were so few academic historians on the list was that, and this is not, you guys are writing very interesting books, but there just aren't, too many of the academic historians have gone down the social science route and therefore are not writing the books that can be read. They're not putting together the knowledge and the work with the telling of the story, and therefore they're losing the ground which used to entirely belong almost to academic historians. They're losing it to people who are, and I agree entirely with what's just been said, who are, what does professional mean? They do the work, they're good writers, and they produce fantastic books. And she says that very clearly, and she laments the kind of social scientification of history in the universities and thinks it's a big mistake.
In your series, Extraordinary Canadians, you profile 18 Canadians, and you don't use
20 actually, because two are double.
Pardon me.
Yeah,
you don't use historians to tell their stories. Is that part of the reason?
No, some. Margaret Macmillan did.
Oh, she did one, okay.
She did Leacock.
Yeah.
But the fact is, it's a big mix of historians and biographers, some of whom are in the academy and many of whom are outside, many of whom are philosophers or public figures or novelists. The thing was, what was their relationship to the story? Did they have a real identity with the story? Did they really want to find out what it meant? Was there something there that meant, and I think it's the thing that hasn't quite been said, you don't write history in order to pronounce on the future or even the present. But if you do it well, you are pronouncing on the present and the future. You can't help it. And I think that all good writers know, I don't think they ask themselves the question when they're writing it because it would ruin the book, but they know that the outcome will be that the readers will say, my God, that's Toronto today, or my God, that's where New York was 10 years ago, or, you know, that's where we should be going, that's where we shouldn't be going. You know, gosh, look at that violence, we must avoid that. So history's always had that role.
Craig, let me ask you this. I'm going to use the term in quotes. Outsiders, journalists, are they doing an okay job telling our history?
Well, yes, but. But
so no.
I've had this urge to jump in for the last few minutes.
Go ahead.
There's no question that the kind of series that John has edited and that Bill is urging us to respect are valuable contributions to our understanding of history. They coexist, however, with a different kind of history that we must also respect and not disparage. Let's take this whipping boy that's been on the table since the beginning of this session, the social science historian. In fact, a great deal of my colleagues would never call themselves social scientists. Professionalization of history that went on over the last half century that encouraged people to have more careful methodologies, more thought through theoretical and historiographical approaches to what they're doing in order to more seriously and rigorously analyze the past. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I also think that some of the publications that result from that are more or less intended for other people in the profession, just as a chemist produces material that's to be consumed by other chemists.
So I don't disagree with that.
And there is then an obligation on us to communicate to larger audiences. And I think one of the things that many of us are conscious of is that we have more than one audience and that we write for different audiences at different points. Some of us try and do it simultaneously. I think David certainly does, and I tried to do that in writing about alcohol. But I don't, and I think that it's a challenge. But the unspoken part of this discussion is, what are the outlets for doing this in a country like Canada? And I know you wanted to talk about that, so maybe I'm edging into your next topic.
Well, I want to ask Bill. Bill, you argue that there's room for both, that we need translators.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the social science developments of the last few generations, indeed, I would agree, have been quite valuable, is sometimes impenetrable. And what they have done is to yield up a mother lode, but then you leave the refining of this, the production of the fine gold, to the skilled writers. And I think it's unfortunate. And I'm, frankly, having been in the academy for all of my professional life, it's unfortunate that so many of my colleagues concentrate so dearly on producing this mother lode and then leaving it to others to wrap it in, to tell a narrative and to tell the story. But I do agree that the work of social scientists in the last few decades has been extraordinarily valuable.
Charlotte, weigh in here.
Well, I know just how dependent I am in writing popular history on incredibly rigorous work within universities by people who have gone through the whole PhD system and whose work I am very conscious that I'm like a jackdaw coming along, picking out the bits that I can then weave into the kind of popular narrative that is going to engage a larger audience than their original research might engage. So I completely agree that we're all writing for different audiences and setting our own sort of intellectual standards. And this does take us into the area that you hinted at, which is in a country like Canada with a very small reading population, can you make a living by writing popular history? Or do you actually have to have an appointment as a teacher in school or university to fund your habit?
There's one group we've left out, which is actually fits in, which is, of course, there's all this amazing work that's been done going into the details and pulling all this stuff out, which is great, and and we all use it. Either the people themselves use it, or people like us go in and use it almost like raw material. And I don't mean that as an insult, but it's there. But there's a whole other group which was always there and is becoming bigger and bigger because of how easy it is to self-publish. Which is, there are all sorts of people going into very small areas, and it might be what they used to call, family histories or stuff like that. And they're putting out on the table just tons and tons of material which gets lost. And they're sort of witnesses of a time. They're done in very peculiar ways sometimes, or they're done very effectively, or they're done for their families. But interestingly enough, you suddenly find that there were, 20 books on a small town written by 20 people who were neither good writers nor academics, but guess what? They're pretty good at noticing what actually happened on the spot. And then without that, we're really stuck. All of us are stuck. I mean, that's almost a replacement for the way one used, say, letters from the 19th and 18th century. It's really interesting. And this new print-on-demand system means that there are literally tens of thousands of these sorts of books pouring out, which are never going to be distributed. They're never going to be larger than 20 people getting them. But,
Okay.
but they're going to have stuff.
Okay, John, we have about 5 minutes left, so I just want to push on through here. You know, it's not just Canadians who are writing about Canadian history. Take a look at these book covers. This is Bill Fowler's book, who's with us tonight. Of course, Empires at War on the 7 Years' War, which resulted in British control of North America. Then a couple of years later, in 2008, David Hackett Fisher, professor at Brandeis University, wrote Champlain's Dream, which told the story of Samuel de Champlain and his creation of French colonies in what is today Canada. And then this year, Alan Taylor, who's a professor at the University of California, Davis, wrote The Civil War of 1812, which tries to reconceive the War of 1812 as an ideological conflict fought between British descendants living in North America. Right. David, you know, what should we make of Americans and others writing about our own Canadian history?
Well, I think it's related to broader trends within American history. You've had it increasingly over the past 2 decades, an Atlantic perspective on American history, a transatlantic perspective, particularly, but not exclusively, in the 18th, early 19th century worlds. And once you start viewing American history through a transatlantic lens, you also start looking at British North America. I mean, the interaction between, or the triangle really, from Britain and Ireland, the colonies, United States, British North America, and then British North America and the United States. And once you start looking at this world as an integrated whole, then it's quite natural for historians such as Alan Taylor and David Hackett Fisher and Bill himself to explore the kinds of issues that they have. So I don't think it's so much a question of Americans going, oh, hey, let's look at Canada and see what's going on up there. I think it's got more to do with that triangular Atlantic historiography.
And but we're missing one, just say we're missing one key element here, which is really problematic, which is we're talking about stuff written in English. This is a country which has a whole tradition written in French, and a lot of the basis of modern Canadian history was a debate between Francophone historians and Anglophone historians through the 30s to the 70s. To really say that as soon as you've read the Anglophone stuff, then, I mean, I agree with everything you said, but actually, if you don't have the debate between the Anglophones and Francophones, and frankly, between the Anglophones, Francophones, and the oral histories coming out of the Aboriginals with more and more insistence, you're actually missing the point of what happened here.
Charlotte, let me ask you. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
I'd like to emphasize something David said about the Atlantic world, because there's been a very, very dramatic shift on this side of the border in the last 10 years, maybe a little bit longer. My generation of historians described ourselves as colonial historians. That doesn't work anymore. Someone studying in the period that I'm interested in, 17th, 18th century, will find them describing themselves as Atlantic historians. In my own university now, for example, we're currently searching for new faculty members, and we describe the job as the Atlantic world. So you're absolutely right about that. It's not just that we're turning our eyes towards Canada. That may or may not be true, depending upon the particular individual. But as a discipline, interested in the 17th, 18th century, the world I'm interested in, we increasingly describe it as the Atlantic world, not as colonial America or colonial France, New France, but we describe it as the Atlantic world.
Charlotte, we got about 30 seconds left. I'm going to just throw this out at you. Would English Canada have a better sense of its national identity if we knew our history better?
I really resent the idea that history is all about identity building. I think history we should be studying because it is the source of so many interesting and wonderful stories, and it is can be a collective effort in building a country, but it's not what the purpose of history is.
Okay, folks, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for coming in tonight. In Boston, we have Bill Fowler joining us on the line, and in our nation's capital,
Thank you very much.
Charlotte Gray. Here in studio, David Wilson, John Ralston Saul, and on my right-hand side, Craig Heron. Thank you all for coming in.